So today we get to have a conversation with two of my friends, two people who I've probably worked closest with over the past year. I don't have any measurement of time anymore. Almost distance, Hakim, over the past year, we probably put in, who knows, 5, 6, 10,000 miles just across the state of Michigan trying to advance the message in the work that they're going to talk about today. So we're talking about second chances, second chance efforts in the state of Michigan. How many people are familiar with the term clean slate? Has anybody heard that? About half, a little bit. Okay, so you're going to get a good education in a clinic on what is happening in the state of Michigan, why it's important, and how you can get involved from two of the people, among others, but two of the people who are spearheading this initiative. So first we have Hakim Crampton, who is a Michigan native. He has been raised between the Lansing and Jackson area here in Michigan, and he currently lives and works in Jackson. Mr. Crampton is the founding director of the Academic Mentoring and Education Network, Amen, for Youth, LLC, Amen. He's also an author of 6 English language arts textbooks and 1 poetry book. Hakim is also the state organizer for the state of Michigan for JustLeadershipUSA, an organization based out of New York, which you'll talk a little bit more about. It is also the former housing case manager for Community Action Agency of Jackson Housing Commission. And in 2019, he became an appointee of Governor Gretchen Whitmer as commissioner to the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. I'd also like to add that Hakim is formerly incarcerated, and I'd like, when he begins to speak, to talk a little bit about how long he's been on parole, and also how many states you've been in the last 60 days. And also we have Josh Ho, who's my colleague at Safe and Just Michigan. Josh Ho is our our policy analyst, and he's also the host of a podcast called Decarceration Nation Podcast. And Josh is also formerly incarcerated, and he's probably been in multiple states in the past 60 days as well. So thank you for being with us today. Please welcome our panelists. So today we're going to talk about the Clean Slate package of bills and how this coalition of stakeholders has worked together over the past year to move this legislation forward. And we like to see it pass through the Senate and be signed by the governor by the end of this year, and some steps that we've been taking to see that happen. So Hakim, I'd like to defer to you first and ask you to describe a little bit about this coalition work, some of the efforts that have been taken as we've zigzagged the state for the past year, excuse me, and how passionate some of the stakeholders are about getting this legislation passed in 2019. But please tell a little bit more about how long you've been on parole first, and how many states literally that you've been in the past few months.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, everyone. Appreciate you guys for being here for this very important topic and discussion. That's a lot to unpack, really. Being someone formerly incarcerated and doing advocacy work in this field and so many interconnecting subject matters and issues. So I was a young 18-year-old that was incarcerated in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1991. Like the Central Park Jogger 5, I was a victim of police interrogation tactics in which 3 of us were arrested, told that each one of us individually confessed to an unsolved murder that none of us had any knowledge of. One of us subsequently falsely confessed, implicated the rest of us in this crime that we had no knowledge of, and we were taken to trial based on his testimony, his statement, found guilty. I was sentenced to 45 years in prison in Milwaukee in 1991. I finally won my freedom after 15 years with the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, who took my case to the Wisconsin parole chairman and essentially advocated for me as the Innocence Project and said, this man deserves to be freed. And the parole chairman agreed that I should not have been arrested, should not have been convicted, and should not have served as much time as I had served, he being a former Milwaukee police lieutenant who worked on the force with the detectives who framed us. And so I got out on parole 13 years ago. And unfortunately, with the way Wisconsin's law is set up, I'm still on parole. I've been on parole now for 13 years, having to report to a parole agent every single month, having to get permission to travel. I don't know how many states I've been in the last 60 days, probably about 4 or 5. Just returned from New York last night. And so doing this work is very critical, and building this coalition when we talk about Clean Slate is very critical for two main points. The first point is that giving voice back to the community, not just the community in itself, but the community that formerly incarcerated peoples come from. Because oftentimes I think we forget that, especially now we're using a term such as returning citizen, we seem to forget that people who are returning home to their communities are actually people from our communities. And the communities that we come from, including us as a part of that community, are some of the people who have the least bit of voice when it comes to legislation, when it comes to policy that impacts and affects us, right? And so building this coalition was really all about building a voice in the community to be impactful with the legislation, as we were seeking to ultimately get a bill introduced that would radically change expungement and clean slate, which really is a radicalization of reentry. Because when we talk about reentry, we're thinking about someone just coming home, needing employment, needing housing. But really what we're talking about is people that have been home 15, 20, and 30 years with criminal convictions and have not been able to successfully gain employment, have not been able to successfully gain housing. Two of the most critical factors that would be contributing to someone's success upon re-entering society. So many people have never ever successfully re-entered, in spite of the fact they have been home for 15, 20 years and have never reoffended again, as they call it, reoffending, and yet still don't qualify to have that record set aside so that they can improve their lives, so they can get the foundation that they need in employment and housing. So build this coalition. We crisscrossed between the entire state, 9 different specific communities, from Muskegon Heights all the way down to Detroit, to Ypsilanti, to Kalamazoo, Lansing, Jackson, everywhere. Building a voice, giving a voice back to the community, asking them for their input, saying, hey, we would like to see a bill introduced. What is your point of view about this? What should legislators know from you as a community about how you feel about your family member and your friends returning back to your community? Oftentimes what we miss is this. There's so much stigmatization about a person coming home with a criminal conviction that the first safety valve, that housing safety valve, is the first place that people are discriminated against. They say, you got to get out and get a job. No, you have to get out and get housing. You have to get that stability first and foremost before you can even go and get a job, right? And so often what happens is that the numbers aren't there when it comes to calculating who is homeless or returning citizens, because many of us go and live with other people. That means we're still homeless. Even if I have a place to lay with my sister or my brother or my mother or a friend, I'm still technically homeless because I don't have a place of my own. Right. So it's very critical that as we talk about reentry and building a coalition for Clean Slate, and as we try to get legislation ultimately passed, that we really talk about the connection between housing and returning home from incarceration.
Thank you, Hakim. Josh, so the state of the legislation that's been introduced, if you could talk a little bit about that and what the process is going forward. And just an overview, the distinction, expungement, clean slate, and how that's being presented for the legislature.
Okay, so we have a package of bills. It's already, the short form is very recently, about a week and a half ago, it passed the House of Representatives here in Michigan, and now it's headed to the Senate. As many of you may know, may not know, we have a little break right now. It's called the hunting break. It started yesterday. And so the legislature will be out till the beginning of December, when we hope it'll be taking up in the Senate. So as for the other question you asked, which is kind of about the difference between what all the terms mean. So when in Michigan, and it means different things in different states, there's different versions of these laws across the country. But in Michigan, when we say expungement, what we mean is a set aside. And what that means is that for your record is literally put to the side for public. The public can't see it, but courts and the police can. So the records still exist. It's not totally wiped away. It's just set aside and you can't see it in the public. And so that's really what the difference in the term is. And what's really unique about this package isn't just that it broadens the amount of things that will be set aside, which it does, but it also creates an automatic mechanism. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but there was a pretty groundbreaking study done by 2 University of Michigan law professors, and they were able to get de-identified data from expungement information. Michigan has an expungement law now that allows you to expunge 1 felony and 2 misdemeanors. And so they were able to take the data from that over a long period of time from the Michigan State Police and other stakeholders and evaluate how that's been working out. And one of the things they found is that there's a huge problem with uptake. That even of the people who are eligible, only about 6.5% were taking advantage of that ability to get their records set aside. And they were able to hypothesize a lot of reasons for that, one of which is it's an incredibly cumbersome process. It's expensive. There's also a lot of trauma associated with going to court. I know personally, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. When I was sentenced, I was supposed to be sentenced on a 10-month. I was supposed to go to jail for 10 months, not to prison. And I show up at the courthouse and I'm just sitting there and I'm just ready to get my thing and go right to jail for my 10 months. I'm all been prepped for this by attorney. And all of a sudden the judge just says, I don't like what you did. You're going to prison, son. And my lawyer had never even told me this was a possibility. I'd done a plea bargain. I didn't realize at the time, because I was pretty naive about all this stuff, that the judge can throw out your plea bargain, that it's you make the deal, but they don't have to take it. And I could have then, taken back my plea and gone through the whole process again, but then you risk the thing that's called the trial penalty. I can explain this more to people later. And so I just decided to go with it, but I ended up doing 3 years in prison. And so, for me, a courtroom's a pretty traumatic place. I don't want to go back into a courtroom. And so, if part of the thing for me to get expunged, although this bill package wouldn't unfortunately affect me, if it did, and it said, well, but the one thing is you have to go back into court, as crazy as it sounds, that would be a barrier for me. That was a really painful experience for me. And I think for other people, it's a lot more painful than I only did 3 years. I got a friend right now who did 44 years. I'm sure the last thing that he wants to do is go back into a court. And so there's all these barriers. And so a lot of people don't go and they don't actually take advantage of expungement. So one of the really unique things about this package is for a great number of Michiganders, we're going to be able to, if you have 2 felonies and up to 4 misdemeanors, it can be automatically expunged after 10 years. So you won't have to go through any of that process. Now, obviously, we would like for it to be everybody, but all of the problem with legislation and doing these kind of battles is that it's a constant process of continuing to push forward and doing as much as you can. And so just the fact that hopefully we'll keep moving the package. We've moved it quite a bit in the last 4 months from where it originally started out. Hopefully we'll continue to move the package in a positive direction, but it is very exciting that these ideas are being included. And if the package were to pass right now, the way it is right now, it would be by far the most progressive legislation in the United States that's been passed to date on this subject.
So let me just get a little bit of clarification when we talk about expungement. What would be the time frame and the parameters for a person who's petitioning for expungement, and also for Clean Slate? What would be the when a person's conviction is set aside with the Clean Slate?
Well, there's 2 kinds of processes we've kind of discussed briefly just a second ago. You've got a petition process, which is the way we do it now and the way it would still be done in a lot of cases after this package passes. And that means you go to a court, you get your record set aside. And then for people who have, for the most part, 2 felonies and 4 misdemeanors, there are some things that are carved out that wouldn't be included automatically. But for a lot of people who have 2 felonies and 4 misdemeanors, that means that within 10 years it would be automatic. Now, there are and there are other, with the petition process, there are all kinds of different rules for when you become eligible. So unless I were to be able to give you a big spreadsheet, it would be hard to do that. But different things become eligible at different times. So for some people, they would become eligible within 3 years. Some people would be 5 years. Some people would be 7 years. Some people would be 10 years. And it's going to be one of those processes. I think one of the things that'll happen after, hopefully this passes, is that we'll be able to start doing some real education in our communities across the state about how people can become eligible, start working with our legal aid, our friends in legal aid across the state to try to bring people the information they're going to need to know how to take advantage of the new law.
Thank you. So put this change of law that we're expecting to take place, how does this affect housing for people? How does this affect their access to housing, employment, and removing some of those barriers that we're talking about here today? What difference does it make?
Yeah, it makes a huge life-saving difference to a lot of people that have criminal histories. For example, as we know right now, landlords are asking that question, whether or not you have a criminal history. And that question in itself, generally, 9 out of 10 times most likely, is a determining factor on whether or not an individual is going to get housing. With a bill package like this, with the opportunity to have expungement, to have that set aside, a landlord wouldn't be able to see that. They would only be able to judge you based on the other criteria, whether or not you have income eligibility, whether or not, for example, you have a good rental history, a rental history at all. They would just be able to offer you the same chance that anyone else would have that same chance to get housing. So a package like this is critical to that discussion. It's very, very important because when we talk about the numbers of people here in Michigan with criminal histories, we're talking about tens of thousands, maybe several 100,000 people that are ineligible to most landlords, ineligible for housing in most of our cities across the state. And that presents one of the greatest barriers to successful reentry. And one of the reasons why, of course, recidivism is also so high. If we can't get housing, therefore I don't have stability to get and maintain employment, what are our chances of successfully staying free? Most oftentimes, without a sufficient income, without housing, people turn to crime. We know that many of our crimes in America today are income related, right? So if people are living grossly in poverty, for example, let's take a city I live in now, Jackson, Michigan, a little over 40% of the city of Jackson is living in poverty, right? And we have a huge high number incarceration rate. So what happens when those young folks or those individuals, young adults, come home from prison with a felony record? Housing is already scarce as it is, right? And then they have now the stigma of having that felony. They can't get housed. In many of our subsidized housing complexes, besides Jackson Housing Commission, for example, many of them, you can't live there on parole, right? It's a no-go. You cannot stay in this apartment complex if you're on parole. You can't get added to anyone's lease, for example, right? And if that becomes one of the biggest barriers to individual successful reentry, then think about employment as the next barrier. You already don't have housing. You're illegally staying with someone probably, and then finding a job. So with this clean slate opportunity, it really opens the door for many people, for tens of thousands, to actually have an opportunity to get housing. So it's critical.
Yeah, and just to play on that for a second, when I went to prison, I was lucky in a lot of ways. I had a master's degree. I had spent 20 years teaching in higher education. And, since I've come out, I've had a lot of opportunities a lot of people don't have because I had that background and because of the color of my skin and a lot of other things. But now, even today, I have a full-time job with Safe and Just Michigan. I've spent a lot of time being a consultant for national organizations. I have a relatively successful podcast. I'm fairly well known, and I still live in a boarding house. And the reason I still live in a boarding house is because there's only 2 people in my whole area that rent to people with records, and I don't have enough money to buy a house, So even with all that success and all that opportunity, I'm 6 years out of being out of prison. I'm still living in a boarding house room. Imagine what it's like for most of my brothers and sisters who are coming back from incarceration who have none of that. It's a pretty big deal, and being able to clear your record gives you a new hope. It means I can walk to any rental company in my area and say, I want an apartment, and they have to say yes because they can't run a background check, because if they do, then I can sue the background check company for using my information. So it's a pretty big deal.
And there's a common sense statistic that they put to building the case of clean slate and expanding expungement, which is when a person has not had any interaction with the courts after 7 years, they are less likely to commit an offense than a person who has not had any encounter with the criminal justice system at all. And so we want to talk about, what are landlords? We want to say, well, what doesn't a landlord have a right? People are people. You can never judge what a person is going to do. And what we're saying is, based on the data, we're saying that a person should be given an equal, fair, level playing field to prove themselves as a person who number one, is a good tenant, a good employee, and has a lot to offer to their community. So I'd just like to ask, we only have about 5 minutes before we wrap this up. I'll pose both of you with a different question. One, what can this group do here today, Hakim, seeing that you and I have been in the streets and pushing this thing in the communities? What can people here do today? What can they take away? How can they extend themselves to us, an invitation to come in and put on a full board presentation that we do? And then Josh, why does this matter to you and people who are in the directly impacted community, not just prison, but jails and people with convictions? And, why does this matter to you? So Hakim, how can we draw these fine people into giving us an invitation into their backyards?
Absolutely. And first and foremost, of course, the thing that I would suggest and say that you all can do is do what you're doing right now. Attending very important conversations about housing that impacts people with criminal history. So you're doing one of the most important things right now. The second thing is, now what are you going to do secondarily after this, right? How do you go back to your community and be impactful in your community? And so one of the things we've been doing to build this coalition is, like I said, we actually set out to build this coalition to give voice back to the community. The people who don't hear from people like yourselves, are our legislators, right? Are our state representatives and our state senators. They need to hear your voice to know what your concerns are, because they're representing their constituency base, right? And at face value, they think that their constituency base doesn't want people like I to be housed somewhere. They want our records to be visible to the public so that the public can be safe, so to speak, from my past behavior. So it's going to take you all to say, hey, we've met people like Troy and Hakim and Josh and many others that are in this room today. And we know there's many other people like them who, given the chance, given the opportunity, can be better neighbors than the neighbors I currently have, for example, right? So it's going to take your voice to actually get to the table, to be registered, right? To be to matter to the community, to matter to the legislators who are passing laws and creating policy that's impacting your community. So Troy pointed out one of the most important things that for us to talk about is that people who have committed past criminal acts in the past and have been far removed from that and have been able to maintain no further contact with the criminal justice system, these, I don't want to say people, so to speak, but people like myself who have been out for this long of time, we are least likely to commit any crimes in our society. That means that we are just as safe, if not safer, than other people, right? So that means that we have to use that crux to get to our landlord association and explain to them how valuable, and not just how valuable, but what we're doing is we're making our communities less safe by blocking people like myself from getting access to housing. Because if I don't get access to housing, I may have to reoffend in order to feed my family. That's not what society wants.
Yeah, so one other thing I want to add there is probably the first week of December on a Thursday, I'm guessing because they do this all the time at 8:30 in the morning, the Senate will hold their first hearing on this package. What's going to help us more than anything else in continuing to move this package and continuing to make sure that they take the voice of all the people into consideration is if that Senate room is full with people from the community as opposed to other stakeholders. And so I know it's impossible I come up here, I work up here and I live in Ypsilanti. So I leave, I get up at about 5 a.m. every day to get up here when I come to work, and I know that's not optimal and people have to work, but if we really want to see this package, we need to show up at the moment when the package is on the floor. Hakim and I were at an event in Flint not so long ago, where, we were talking about why it matters. And I think that's what Troy asked me there. And, the truth is I know we get cynical and we see all the stuff that's happening in politics and everything gets tough, but we are what makes the difference. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. I was part of a national piece of legislation where the reason it made it onto the floor at all is because 1 million people called the Senate Majority Leader and said, we want this bill on the floor. It doesn't seem like it's doing any good, but when we all stand up, it makes a difference. And we are a young movement, this criminal justice reform movement. Criminal justice reform's been around a long time, but we've only started to get power recently. And we're starting to win. And the way we continue to win is by all of us continuing to show up and demanding change. And so I think for me, what's really important about this is it's showing that because we've worked for all these months and because we've gone all over the state and because, Hakim and I, if you told us 5 years ago, if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be in rooms negotiating with the Prosecutors Association, I would have told you were crazy. When I'm coming out of prison, I don't think that's even something that's in my imagination, but it happens, and it's happened. You've been in that room too. We can make a difference. We do make a difference, but we don't make a difference if we don't show up. And so what's important is that we show up, in my opinion.
Thanks, both of you. I just want to put a little illustrative pin in this. My wife and I, we own our own home. We also own 3 additional properties that are rental properties. I've been working for Safe and Just for 2 years now, a contractor for 6 months before that. And if I were to go to rent from someone today, which I have in the past, I had to try to seek temporary housing shortly after I was released from prison, and I was told that they like their tenants to be 10 years removed from their situation. And this is what it's like. And we have a person like Hassan who's working on a $50 million development for people who are coming home from jail and prison and who are marginalized. And so when we have cases like that, when we have people like us who are trying to become the solution to the problem that we actually created, but is also part of, as it's been said, strategically intentional. We think things can change, and so we thank you. We thank Hakim and Josh for their time. Please thank them. Do you have either one of you have any last comments that you'd like to share? No?
I just wanted to say, we go to a lot of panels and we talk a lot. It's really nice to be in a room where there's a lot of formerly incarcerated people in the room, because usually we're up here explaining, and people who've worked with a lot of people it's just nice to be in a different kind of room for a change. So
thank you. Please thank our panelists.